So if you're lawful good, you can't break the law. And the rest of the party might be a bunch of rogues that want to do a few dodgy things, and that doesn't really fit with your characters. We'll talk about that in another video of alignment and how it can function in a party, because there's always ways around it. Next up is the fighter. Well, sorry, no. Next up is the druid. Now, druid are another wilderness folk. Okay, they are very close with the wild, so much so that they worship nature. They have divine magic as well, but they worship nature in itself, and they get animal companions and stuff, and they're very powerful characters. They get a lot to them. However, they're another one that can be tricky to play, because if you worship nature, you're practically a vegan. You certain circumstances you can't eat meat, you can't cut down trees to make fire, you can't wear armor that's metal. So there is ways of it in the book to work around that, depending on what sort of nature you were, where you grew up, whether you grew up in mountains or forest, what sort of wilderness, and where your allegiances lie. But yeah, next up after that is the fighter, which is pretty self-explanatory. Fighters are a very underrated class, because a lot of people think, oh, hit it with sword. No, that's not the case. Fighters, they lack in skills. They really lack in skills. However, they make up for it with feats. Now, feats are abilities in Dungeons and Dragons that you can't get you can't get through otherwise. You get them through leveling up. Fighters get bonus feats, and a lot of it is combat tactics. So a good player for a fighter is somebody that knows their abilities and can position themselves on the battlefield and know exactly how those abilities work and how to exploit it to deliver the most damage. So fighters are best brought forward by smart people that are going to think tactically. So, like I said, every class brings something to the table. It's always handy to have a fighter about. Next class is the monk, for the basic classes. Monk is something I don't use in my games. The reason for that is they're very overpowered with the abilities they get. But it's more of a Shaolin monk than it is like a religious monk. So it's somebody that studies martial arts. They get a 5-finger exploding heart technique where they strike a few pressure points, and at any point they can just instantly kill something like that. So yeah, that's another reason why I don't really like characters to play them, and I don't have it in my party. It's one of those classes that is I don't allow unless somebody is going to meet some certain criteria of how they're going to play their monk. Are they going to play a pacifist or stuff like that? But it's the case of they're very overpowered characters, and sometimes you get problem players that are going to exploit that. So that's one to be wary of depending on what your party is. Next up, Ranger. Now, Rangers, think of Aragorn from Lord of the Rings. The Rangers are people that can track, people that can hunt, very skilled with a bow or swords, and they get they get different trees that you can go down. But yeah, they're all about tracking, hunting, and but yeah, very useful characters. And they're another one that are they're another character class that's overlooked sometimes of how useful they can be. Next up after the Ranger is the Rogue. Like I said, one of my favourite classes to have in a party. I would recommend to anyone playing D&D in general is if you're going to make a character and you want to bring some characteristics in, take a couple of levels in Rogue. You won't regret it. You get lots of skills. You get the sneak attack ability and stuff like that, and they are just great fun because they allow you to be that little bit chaotic. They allow you to have those extra things in bluff and pickpocketing and all those things that make a game interesting. You know, the kind of things that players are going to want to do when they're messing around in a tavern on their downtime. but also very useful on the battlefield, especially when they can hide and scout ahead. But that's something rangers can do. However, they don't get the sneak attack abilities that rogues do. So next up, we've got sorcerer and wizard. Here's your spellcasters. Here's the guys that do arcane magic. Very powerful. And you know, when somebody has a high level wizard or a high level sorcerer, they have been through it. They have been through some trials, because at the start they're so weak they can't take the damage. However, they can deliver it with their spells. They're like a glass cannon, like a nuke. However, when you're first starting out, I do advise you to steer away from spellcasters, because spells is what can make the start of a venture very complicated, especially if you're not familiar with the rules. One thing I will definitely say as well is always have references. Always have page numbers for your books. You know, definitely on your abilities and all of your spells, make sure you've got page numbers. And if somebody's playing a spellcaster, talk to them. Just be like, look, you're playing something really cool. I really appreciate it, because they've got to put more effort in than all the other players, because they have to do their research. And it's a case of just talking to them, of saying, look, when everyone else is having their turn, do you mind? That's when you look through the books. So when it comes to your turn, you're ready. Because that's another thing to think about, is sometimes an adventure can drag a bit if you're starting out, because people are not sure of their abilities and they'll be looking through them. You'll ask them what they want to do and they'll be like, I don't know, and looking down at the book, like thinking about their options, because it is a little overwhelming sometimes, especially when you have a lot of options. And that still happens at high levels sometimes, because people have so many things at their disposal that they're not sure what to do. So it's always worth talking to your players and just saying, look, like, we're trying to flow the game a little better. If we really want it to flow, is think about what you want to do before you do it. You know, there is ways around it as well, of like when it comes to the initiative rolls, you know who's in turn. So I showed you that little initiative tracker that I had. Well, that's really useful for people, because people can look at that, see whose turn it is, see when their turn is coming up, and when they need to be ready for when it happens. And they also have a little hourglass. So if people are taking a bit long, I flip over the hourglass and be like, look, you've gone to there, or you lose your turn because you've hesitated. You know, it's all about the game functioning. So yeah, we've talked about the basic classes. Now we're going to talk about some prestige classes that you can add on to your basic ones. So, just going to go through the list of contents again, and here we are. So we have Arcane Archer. I'm only going to talk about a few of these because there's so many options. Like I mentioned before, when it comes to 3.5, I have 30 or 40 books on my laptop that I'm not going to go through. I'm just going to talk about some of the classes that I've experienced and how useful they've been. So the prestige class, we have Arcane Archer, that will obviously be an extent on your ranger or your bard or whoever's using a bow, because they can imbue arrows with magic, which is very useful. You've got stuff like Assassin, which I talked about earlier. There's also a Dwarven Defender. So if you take a Dwarf and you took a Fighter, Dwarven Defender is somebody that can stand there and tank the damage all day long and not worry about a thing. As long as they stay still, their armour class increases. So if you've got a narrow pathway, yeah, for example, there's only a 5 foot wide, narrow pathway, monsters are coming and you want to bottleneck them, stick that Dwarven Defender right in the middle, because they've all got to take that bugger on, and that bugger can take the damage and deal it. You know, some of my other favourite ones is something called a Dervish, which is somebody that dances while they fight. So they tend to use 2 slashing weapons, and they dance across the battlefield, and they get extra movement depending on how often they've hit their target. So they can clear a battlefield no problem, and they are very good characters to play. Also, we've spoke about of how fond I am of the Cthulhu mythos. There's new races in this book, new classes as well, such as witches and warlocks. Other ones to think about in the other books are warlocks in general. and how they don't have divine magic or arcane magic, they have eldritch ability. So they make a contract with a, how to put this? Like a celestial creature. So something like an angel or a demon. Not so much a god, but something that's in the same realm of a god. And that's where they get their power from. And they get like Eldritch Blast and stuff. Other basic characters in the other books, you've got Ninja, which they get key abilities, where they get certain points of key abilities a day, and they can spend them to do stuff like turning invisible and focus energy on a strike to deal extra damage. Also, there's Samurai. They're just a couple from another book called Oriental Adventures, which is